Hi, this is Garibay, and today I am going to be talking about Dungeons and Dragons history, specifically in the year 1987. This is the 16th year of Dungeons and Dragons. Excuse me. This is the 14th year of Dungeons and Dragons history, specifically. And today we're going to be talking about 1987 through the filter of clear: catalysts, locations, entities, artifacts, and relationships. So who was the catalyst for Dungeons & Dragons in 1987? Well, 1987, one of the catalysts for Dungeons & Dragons was George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars. So George Lucas is now 4 years out from the creation of the Star Wars trilogy. Return of the Jedi, Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. They are all finished, and at this point, he is basking in the glow of one of the greatest achievements within the history of American film and world film. Actually, he is also enjoying huge dividends from the decision to take merchandising on Star Wars. He knew that the toys would be big, and he's literally multi-millionaire at this point. And he's just really enjoying the fruits of his labor, right? Well, one of those fruits is the West End game Star Wars tabletop role-playing game. George Lucas, under his umbrella, the Star Wars tabletop role-playing game is just one of the literally thousands of licenses that would be signed for Star Wars overall, right? And now, absolutely, for George Lucas, it was just one of many licenses, right? But for the tabletop role-playing game industry, it would change many things for us as tabletop role-playing gamers. Excuse me. So one of the things that will change specifically is it will change the idea that worlds for tabletop role-playing games have to be generic. They have to come from books. And it will also declare right from the beginning that there would be absolutely no licenses that would not be up for discussion for tabletop role-playing game access, right? And so West End Games gets the Star Wars license. Now, to this day, Star Wars has had several owners, and is still a tabletop role-playing game to this very day. However, in 2019, the idea and the changes for licensing for tabletop role-playing games is different. It is a different world. But in 1987, George Lucas, he absolutely would be part of what is pushing Dungeons and Dragons forward with momentum, showing Dungeons and Dragons, every Dungeons and Dragons designer, that there's work to be done in virtually any world that it needs to be done for, right? And also, it will also be shining back to Dungeons and Dragons that maybe they're not done with all of the different settings that they need to create, right? Although they are making a lot of settings at this point, it is starting to really snowball. But Spelljammer will come out later, and that will have many lifts. Actually, it will have influences from Star Wars. Okay, so that's our catalyst for 1987. What is our location? Well, our location is Fort Wayne, Indiana, and that is where Chessex headquarters is. So Chessex is starting up now. Chessex is a company that makes its bread and butter on dice, and the tabletop role-playing game industry will be just a huge part of what they do, and really their primary focus. And Chessex sells dice, continues to sell dice to this very day, and Chessex will also stand as a denoter, an indicator of the fact that the dice industry is a large industry, and that there are many there will be many companies that will be standing right beside Chessex, right? And also Chessex, Fort Wayne, Indiana, continues to show us that for Dungeons and Dragons in America, many of the biggest, most important, most innovative things comes from the coast, from the right coast and the left coast the West Coast and the East Coast. But the reality is, from the very, very beginning, Dungeons and Dragons would come from the heartland. It would come from the heartland of American states. It would come from states that are later called flyover states. But here we see Gary Gygax and Chessex creators declaring, no, there's innovation in the heartland of America too, not just on the coast. And it's a really distinct, unusual thing. Of course, Dungeons and Dragons its current home is on the West Coast, out in Seattle. So, but its origins comes from the heartland. Okay, and also that also shows to this very day, it is difficult for the heartland to continue to keep brilliant, shining things for themselves. It can be challenging, right? So that is our location, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Who is our entity? Well, our entity for 1987 is Gene Roddenberry. Okay, now Gene Roddenberry is the creator of Star Trek. Now, he had created Star Trek in 1960, in the late 60s, right? And so Star Trek comes out in the late 60s, and literally while mankind is walking on the moon, he has a show on television, Gene Roddenberry, that he created, that is just shining this bright future of U.S. space travel, right? Now, 1986 would be an absolute, in many ways, it's not a death blow, but it seems like a mortal blow, with the Challenger exploding. The optimism around space travel really, really changes. However, Gene Roddenberry is right there in 1987, and he is standing aside as Star Trek The Next Generation begins. So what he had started in the late 60s, now we are looking in the late 80s for a reignition, right, of excitement about space travel, and that excitement is coming exactly when the country needs it most. When there's really been a terrible like wet blanket thrown on all the hopes of human space travel, right? So Gene Roddenberry is very much our entity of 1987, and the start of the TNG show is a really, really big. It really changes the shape of what America thinks about space travel, and this is a big impactor on Dungeons and Dragons players, because space will be one of the things, Dungeons and Dragons players and game masters and designers by nature are always looking beyond the mundane, right? They're looking into fantasy world. They're seeing the world around them, but they're looking into fantasy worlds, and at the same time, they're looking up at the stars and saying, are there worlds for us to go out and to explore and to have interactions out there, and maybe there's combat too. Like the three pillars of Dungeons and Dragons: interaction, combat, and exploration. And actually, Gene Roddenberry's right there saying, hey, combat should be the least of them, and you should be ready to defend yourself, but you certainly don't want to be doing that first. And that's Gene Roddenberry had a really good point for our Dungeons and Dragons games too. That really the more we can keep that focus on interaction and exploration, the better. Not the better our games are. I think a lot of Dungeons & Dragons players really like combat. The game was built for combat from the very beginning. But also I think Dungeons & Dragons has always called us to be better players, better dungeon masters, better designers, and better people, right? So, that those three pillars of Dungeons & Dragons: combat, interaction, and exploration, we really need to make sure that combat pillar is not larger than it needs to be. And there have been many, many times in the game where that has been the case, all right? So our entity is Gene Roddenberry. What is our artifact? Well, our artifact is just a regular pepperoni pizza, right? Ordered from your local pizza shop, right? And the reason why is there are going to be there are certain American pastimes that have sold a lot of pizza, right? One of them is football. All of our sports certainly sell a lot of a lot of pizza, right? But Dungeons and Dragons will be one of the things where you get together with your friends, you order a pizza, right? And if you think that I'm making too much of this, go back to 1987 and just flip through some of the core rule books, and you will see pizza literally listed in the book as, you know, as a core component for your game, that you will need snacks, right? And to this day, you know, there are still people who think that that food is part of Dungeons and Dragons, and in the late 1987s, it was really very much thought of. Food and snacks were part of the game, right? Now, one of the reasons why food was part of the game in 1987 is the length of a Dungeons and Dragons game. What's the length of a Dungeons and Dragons game? 4 hours. Now that is incredibly long, right? Especially today. But the reality is, 1987, there were many groups that were getting together at noon and play until midnight, right? You know, it was bonkers. It's hard to even tell you, like, because people were, you know, looking at Dungeons and Dragons in its 14th year of history, they were really, you know, pressing into these the idea that these games were really special, and they were dedicating large amounts of time to these games. And so 4-hour games were the norm, and many groups were making entire days, 6, 8, 10, 12-hour sessions, right? So the pepperoni pizza was absolutely the artifact of the year for 1987. Excuse me. And take a look. You will actually see pizza listed in many core rule books, as you're going to need this. It's quite humorous, right? What is the relationship for Dungeons and Dragons in 1987? The relationship for Dungeons and Dragons in 1987 is language. Dungeons and Dragons will have a relationship with language. It will have a relationship with language in many different forms, right? Okay, so here are just some of the forms, okay? So at this point, we're into second edition of Dungeons and Dragons in 1987. You're looking at the second edition of Dungeons and Dragons. So what is the actual, how does that actually flow out as far as the overall, how does the language connect? Well, the biggest thing is, in second edition, you had alignment languages, and so there were languages for the player characters and for non-player characters that aligned with their languages. So if you were a neutral good, you could speak to another neutral good person, which is really unusual. Also, the races within the game, right? So there was Draconic, there was Abyssal, there was Common, there was Dwarvish, there was Sylvan. So you have these race languages that are in the game. And then also, even in the 14th year of its history of Dungeons and Dragons, in the IRL, you have a very real connection to language as well. And that is the continued translation of Dungeons & Dragons into multiple languages. And to this very day, when Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition was published, it was almost immediately translated into 7 languages, right? And so throughout the game, there would be different languages that the game would be translated into. So Dungeons & Dragons very clearly has a relationship with language, right? Which is really quite interesting. That is a J. Scott Garibay clear history of Dungeons & Dragons in the year 1987, the 14th year of Dungeons & Dragons history. Thank you very much for continuing this journey through Dungeons & Dragons history with me. Please consider letting me know your thoughts. What was going on in your D&D world in 1987? And if you would, please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful day.